But with that, let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Annie Drapkin, professor in the departments of Social Medicine and Obstetric and Gynecology, and Associate Director of the Center of Bioethics at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you, Annie, for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And actually, my last name is Lyerly. Drapkin is my maiden name, and it keeps coming up. My dad was born and raised in Boston, so maybe that's why I think he must be smiling from beyond. But so lest you think randomized controlled trials are the answer, Sonia asked me to talk about some of the challenges of randomized trials in pregnancy, of which there are many. Let's see. It's given many options for advancing the slides and picks the one that doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about something that I call the pregnancy paradox. And this is something that happens across medicine, but as is the case for many things, COVID brought forth a challenge that is, beneath the surface or very familiar to some people. So COVID-19 was known early on to be associated with increased risks during pregnancy, severe illness, ICU admission, death, and poor pregnancy outcomes such as preterm birth and stillbirth. Nevertheless, pregnant people were excluded from all vaccine trials that led to the authorization of the vaccines, and vaccines approved under EUA were approved under EUA without human pregnancy data. So, one of the most at-risk populations didn't have data to inform their choices about whether to get vaccinated. So this is a problem, like I said, across medicine. For many years, people said, well, the reason that we're not including pregnant people in biomedical research is because you can't do it ethically. So I'm a bioethicist, and that struck me as a very problematic argument. So in the 2000s, I co-founded with a couple of other bioethicists something called the Second Wave Initiative. Sonia and several of our panelists were there during those initial conversations, and it was an effort to reframe the ethics of research in pregnancy and articulate the ethical reasons why we needed to do things differently. Following the Second Wave Initiative, I've had several projects that have developed ethics guidance for doing research primarily in infectious disease settings, and I'll be drawing on some of those insights today. So, this history of excluding pregnant people, we call it the Second Wave Initiative because inclusion based on gender has come in waves, if you will. So there's been a history of exclusion, first of all, of women generally from research. So in the early 1990s, women and their health interests were noted to be underrepresented in biomedical research. When this came to bear, in 1993, Congress passed the Revitalization Act, and it required that exclusion of women and minorities from biomedical research needed to be justified by reasons other than cost. And women are now a majority of research participants, although gaps remain in several disease contexts. So the second wave was spoke to the fact that pregnant people and their health interests, although women were included, pregnant people and their health interests remained excluded. The result was and continues to be a dearth of information to guide treatment and prevention. And the Second Wave Initiative, as I said before, was really an effort initially to articulate the ethical arguments for inclusion, to say ethics doesn't prevent research with pregnancy. In fact, ethics requires it. So at the core of those arguments are the harms that the evidence gaps entail and the ways in which pregnancy-specific evidence is a critical need for the health of pregnant people and their offspring. There are really three areas of needed evidence. We've focused a lot on teratogenicity and think initially about that usually, but I think about it in three spaces. One is there's a critical need for dosing that reflects the physiologic changes of pregnancy. So the pregnant body is different, it processes drugs differently, but the pharmacokinetic parameters for drugs drug use in pregnancy are uncharacterized for the vast majority of drugs. Without pregnancy-specific PK, pregnant people may be underdosed, leading to exposure to untreated disease, which is also in some cases a teratogen, or they may be exposed to toxicities of too much drug. Fetal safety data that establishes the likelihood of birth defects and longer-term impacts is also missing for well over 9 out of 10 drugs that are on the market. Without it, children can be, fetuses who will become children can be exposed to either inappropriate or more likely unknown risks. And then thirdly, we need maternal outcomes that predict the impact of treatment on maternal health. So even when we know that a drug is safe for the fetus, oftentimes maternal outcomes are not gathered. And without that, women who are pregnant or individuals who are pregnant may be exposed to inappropriate or uncertain risk. So, of course, the reason that the studies aren't done is because people don't want to relate to these uncertainties in the context of a research study, right? So they want to avoid research-related risk. The problem is when you don't do research in pregnancy, the risk doesn't disappear. Instead, what happens is something called risk shifting, which means that the risk just shifts to the clinical context where it grows. So that's one of the profound consequences of not doing this research. A second is something I call reticence. So reticence is the fact that when data are either absent or incomplete, that can lead to reluctance among patients and physicians to use indicated therapies that are needed to maintain health during pregnancy. It also can lead to guideline reticence, in which guidelines recommend against a drug that is indicated or that patients talk to their doctor or that it's a personal choice. However, this is not really a better safe than sorry regimen because alternative treatments and preventives may be understudied or suboptimal. So the alternatives to one drug might be another drug that has an equally poor evidence base. Failure to treat may harm both the pregnant person and the fetus, and harms of undertreatment may far outweigh any potential risks of the treatment or preventive. So one of the sort of very dramatic impacts of not having data around the COVID vaccine were mixed messages that came up after the authorization of the vaccine, right? So it was authorized in December 2020. As we know, pregnant women of childbearing potential, people of childbearing potential, and pregnant people made up a huge proportion of healthcare workers, teachers, folks who were most at risk and had to think about whether to be vaccinated. So what was the guidance? CDC said, vaccines are unlikely to pose a specific risk to people who are pregnant. Vaccination is a personal choice for people who are pregnant. How helpful is that? Sorry. WHO, on the other hand, took a firmer stance and said they recommend not to use the vaccine in pregnant women unless the benefit outweighs potential vaccine risks. What are those? ACOG and the Society for Maternal and Fetal Medicine said that authorized vaccines, and I think presciently said this because they knew what people did around uncertainty, should not be withheld from pregnant women who choose to receive them. WHO got some pushback and they revised their guidance to say that pregnant women at high risk of exposure or who have comorbidities may be vaccinated. So language really mattered here. But anyway, this is what happens in the absence of data. Another thing that happened in the absence of data was extremely low vaccination rates among pregnant people. By September of 2021, only 31% of people who were pregnant had been vaccinated. Among Black people who were pregnant, 15%, abysmal, which led to a CDC health advisory and a slight bump in the vaccination rate among pregnant people. The other implication is that the absence of data has different impacts depending on which country they are interpreted in, and what Zavala et al. Found was that low and middle income countries were more likely to constrain access to vaccines in the absence of data. And when they did eventually recommend vaccination, they cited the absence of data as a reason. Well, they cited the absence of data as a reason not to recommend, and observational data as a reason for shifting policies. So the absence of data increases disparity. So another moral reason that to proceed with data gathering. So it's been recognized by many that, including the FDA, most recently in their draft guidance for industry, that filling the knowledge gaps regarding safe and effective use of drugs is a critical public health need, but one that raises complex issues. And a task force established by the 20th Century Cures Act indicated that a cultural shift is necessary to emphasize the importance and public health significance of building a knowledge base to inform medical decision-making. Research on therapies for these populations must be facilitated and greatly augmented. So as you can see, there's a wave forming here, but this is 10 years after our original second wave meeting. So it's been taking some persistence, if you will. So one of the things that we have been seeing helpfully are a trio of conceptual shifts towards inclusion. So one is a shift from thinking about pregnant people as a vulnerable population. They have, until 2018, been listed among other populations, children, prisoners, and individuals with intellectual disabilities as vulnerable. Obviously, they do not share with those populations constraints to their autonomy. So the argument has been made that that is an inappropriate designation for pregnant people, both inaccurate and had a chilling effect on research. So they were removed from that list in the federal guidance for research, and several organizations recommend calling them a complex population instead. The second sort of conceptual shift was from protecting pregnant people from research to protecting them through it. You'll hear this around now. The NIH uses this language to think about research as not just a threat to health, but as a pathway to it. And third, from a notion of presumptive exclusion. If you want to do a research study, it used to be, as long as you can prove that none of the people who are participating in your study are going to be pregnant, then you're good to go. And now there is movement toward requiring justification for excluding pregnant people as well. South Africa has some guidance to that end. And if you look at the PREGLAC task force report, they say that inclusion of pregnant women and lactating women in clinical trials is essential unless there are compelling scientific reasons for the exclusion. So we, as an ethics group, articulated 3 ethical foundations that support research with pregnant people. One is protection from intervention-related risks. So if you think about thalidomide was the product of not doing research. It wasn't the product of doing research. So an animating mission of doing biomedical research is when the drugs are on the market, the public can be assured that they have been tested and that they are safe for them to take. Pregnant women do not enjoy that assurance. Access to the benefits of new technologies. Research is oftentimes needed so that people can get the drugs that they need. If the research isn't there, then either the label or the insurance company or the government is less likely to recommend or allow access to it. So pregnant people have not had fair access to cutting-edge therapies. And finally, respect for pregnant people's own health. So when research is done, oftentimes it focuses on the impact of drugs on the fetus and fails to think about the impact of drugs on the pregnant person. I always talk about the fact that the NICHD, a major funder of research in pregnancy, does not have an M in it. There's still some challenges, though, especially, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of randomized trials, since we've heard about some of the challenges of other methodologies. And I'm just going to talk about two key ones quickly with the time I have left remaining. One has to do with the timing and the ethics of post versus pre-approval RCTs. And the second has to do with the risk distortions associated with the ethics of earlier inclusion. So timing, pre versus post licensure. So the argument often goes, why don't we just test this intervention on the non-pregnant population? When we know that it works, then we'll do the studies in pregnancy. And this, this was certainly part of what was discussed with the COVID vaccine. We've seen it with pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, you name it. This is sort of the language that you hear. So but the thing is, if you do a study pre-approval, there are advantages, right? One would be that it would avoid the uncertainty, the fear, the gaps that existed, for instance, in the COVID situation that were filled by disinformation. If we had the data earlier, maybe the vaccination rates in pregnancy would have been higher. It avoids broad exposures to harms of unsafe drugs or exposure to disease. So if you know those data earlier on, you get them as soon as you can, then fewer people are going to be exposed to those kinds of harms, and it may facilitate access to beneficial treatment. Post-approval, the benefits are obviously that it, as I said before, it avoids exposure to an investigational drug, something that certainly drug companies would like to do. It mitigates potentially, we don't really know, liability concerns, and is financially advantageous. So the DART studies, the developmental and reproductive toxicology studies that you need to do, the preclinical studies that you need to do before you can enroll a pregnant person, you can save those to the last minute until you know you're going to move ahead with your phase 3 trial. And if you can do those at the last minute, then you could save a lot of money. So that's been one of the arguments for waiting until post-approval. But there are a couple of things I want to bring up about those two spaces. One is post-approval raises some ethical questions for the ethics of a randomized trial. And I think, again, this was brought forward very powerfully with the COVID story. So actually, really interestingly, in February of 2021, right, not that long after authorization, Pfizer commenced a randomized trial to evaluate their vaccine in pregnancy, right? A randomized controlled trial. So this was vaccine versus no vaccine. But in September 2021, the study was delayed by slow enrollment. And you might just think, well, pregnant people do not like to participate in studies. I'm going to disabuse you of that in a second. But the problem actually was of something called equipoise. So one of the ethical constructs that helps justify a randomized trial is that there is genuine uncertainty or disagreement about the risks and benefits of one arm versus the other. Well, by September 2021, we were pretty sure that the vaccine worked and that they were beneficial, right? And that a placebo in the context of COVID exposure was a pretty risky thing to do. And this was reflected in an article in the Wall Street Journal. A clinician scientist said, it's hard to enthusiastically recommend the study when you've got a vaccine out there. The scientist hat I wear says you want those patients, but obviously the clinician in me says, you got to get your vaccine. So there was no equipoise. Ethically problematic study, actually. So now to disabuse you of the idea that a pregnant person wouldn't want to participate in a pre-approval study. Now, you guys were probably, many of you were like little people when the swine flu was a thing, or maybe you were in, I don't know, but some of you were not little. But it was a very scary flu virus. The first person who died from swine flu, this was 2009, was a pregnant person. And I was at Duke at the time. They were doing a randomized trial, actually, of 2 different doses of the flu vaccine, pre-approval. And what happened there was they accrued everybody that they were thinking about recruiting for that, like within a week. The doors were getting, people were barreling down the doors. So I wanted to interview these pregnant people about why they participated or did not participate in the study. And what we heard were sort of 3 pretty logical and interesting things. One, that they wanted access to something that they had a very high suspicion was beneficial and was timely for many of these people because maybe they were getting close to delivery time. I was very excited to be able to participate just because at that point in time, the vaccine wasn't really widely available. So I was able to get it at least 2 or 3 weeks prior to when they would have. Safety. This is one I think of the most interesting findings of this study was the notion that people felt safer in a study versus not in a study. This person said, I felt like because I was in the study, I was more closely looked at and watched, followed, rather than somebody who was just given the flu shot or an H1N1 shot. So people have often said that being cared for in pregnancy is like a phase 4 trial gone amok because they don't gather any data. So that was sort of the notion that people felt safer in a trial than outside of it. And then altruism, which we hear about in many studies. I'm not sure that the sisterhood of pregnancy or the personhood of pregnancy would have such a draw without the other 2, but it does seem to have a powerful draw across kinds of research. So the second piece that I just want to call attention to is the second challenge to doing RCTs are risk distortions. Am I way over time? No? Okay. So this is kind of like the last thing I'm going to say, not my last slide, but which is there's a legal scholar named Cass Sunstein, and he articulated something he called misfearing. Human beings, he said, are prone to misfearing. Sometimes they are fearful in the absence of significant danger, and sometimes they neglect serious risks. And this is absolutely true in pregnancy. So one example in pregnancy, and there are many different kinds of examples of the way that risk is distorted, but in pregnancy, there is a effort to eliminate fetal risk. There's the notion that no risk to the fetus is acceptable. Even in contrast to children, we know that children face risks, but fetuses cannot and should not. So I have a picture, a Picasso sketch of Don Quixote here, but the idea that there is a quixotic risk to eliminate fetal risk without due regard for the health interests of women are the ways that maternal and fetal interests are intertwined. So there are 2 kinds of misfearing that I think happen in pregnancy that have come forward in vaccine research. One is misfearing unlikely risk. So the interesting thing about the COVID vaccines is that they were mRNA vaccines. And mRNA, and think again about the WHO language there. mRNA vaccines that were authorized don't have theoretical risk associated with them. And we can talk about vaccines that do, but the mRNA vaccine did not. There wasn't a way that was thought about that this was going to pose a potential risk for a fetus. The animal data, which we've heard were available, sometime before authorization, also showed no reproductive risk. The human data suggested that there were some risk of a fever, but that could be treated with antipyretic medications. We know that fevers in pregnancy are not good for fetuses, but they can be treated. And so all we did not have were the human pregnancy data. And nevertheless, the WHO recommended not to use the mRNA vaccine in pregnant women unless the benefit outweighs potential vaccine risk. Unlikely, uncertain, right? Then there's also misfearing of theoretical risk. So there are vaccines that we call replicating vaccines that are taught to OBGYN residents as big no-nos. You should not give these to pregnant people. Rubella is the classic one, yellow fever, some of the Ebola vaccines. These are the ideas that these vaccines can replicate and infect the fetus. You know, it turns out that as I was doing the research on this, I learned that there has never been a case of vaccine-associated rubella in a fetus, even though, you know, we've been told for years that we shouldn't give rubella vaccine in pregnancy. So, but the worries about theoretical risk have led in the rubella case to delayed pandemic control. What we know, and heartbreakingly, have led to many abortions of exposed pregnancies that probably would have been fine, but because of the theoretical risk were terminated. And then constrained access to life-saving treatment. And the example of that is the Ebola vaccine. This is a dramatic example. Ebola is I'm sure all of you know, a life-threatening infection, and in pregnancy has a very, very high mortality rate. 89 to 93% of people who are pregnant die from Ebola, and almost 100% of their fetuses die. There was an epidemic in 2013 to 2016, and there were pregnancy exclusions in all drug and vaccine trials, despite these very high risks to pregnant people and fetuses. And the charge was brought up, and I think appropriately, by researchers and bioethicists that pregnant people were protected to death. So in conclusion, there is broad recognition that research in pregnancy is an ethical imperative. I think the second wave is really starting to build. Pregnant people deserve protection, access, and respect. COVID-19 revealed enduring challenges, especially for RCTs. There's a tension between the window of opportunity to study and aversion to uncertainty. And moreover, inappropriate weighting of another challenge is inappropriate weighting of risks and benefits and risk distortions. So given the challenges, I do think, you know, additional approaches to informing care are absolutely critical. So I want to end with this picture of, this is Francis Kelsey with President Kennedy. So Francis Kelsey is a person who in the United States blocked approval of thalidomide. And she's really, you know, her name and her ethic are synonymous with the FDA. She is getting the Presidential Medal of Honor, Civilian Medal of Honor from the president here. And you might think, well, how would she feel about the state of affairs that exists today? Well, a colleague of mine went into the archives. She pulled the Kelsey papers. We have a paper on this, but I don't think she would be very happy about it. She was a champion for doing research. She said it would indeed be unfortunate if fear of adverse effects to the offspring deprived the mother of drugs that might be essential to her well-being and indeed possibly to the successful outcome of the pregnancy itself. So thank you very much.